Hello, my name is Michael Freeston, Director of Quality Improvement at the Early Years Alliance. Welcome to today's webinar, Super Sounds. I'm joined by Isobel Wratislaw, Lynsey, Weston and Sian Ansell. Say hello, everybody.
Hello.
To take us through today's session, just by way of introduction, my role is to act as chair to filter any questions that you may have and to keep everybody well behaved and on track. Looking at me glumly. Just to see if everybody can see my slides, and I'll just move on. For those of you who are new to webinars, don't panic. They are very similar, they are the same as a seminar, but they are on the web, which allows us to reach a lot more people from the comfort of their own homes. We will be looking to do about a 30 to 40 minute presentation taking you through today's topic, and there is time at the end for questions to be asked, but please don't wait. You will have on your toolbox a little space where you can type in any question or comment that you have. Part of my role is to weave those seamlessly into as questions into the team here. So what you will see is that box on your screen in front of you, hopefully, and anything you type in only gets seen by me. Nothing is shown to others who are attending, so no questions are too foolish or too straightforward. I will try and weave them in as best we can. This is the third webinar in the series, which is supported by the Department for Education as part of the BS voluntary, I've forgotten it, BSc grant funding for First and Foremost. We've already recorded a general introduction to SL, Sian developments in early years provision and the Loss for Words a couple of months ago, both of which are available on the Early Years Alliance's YouTube page. Ditto for today. Super Sounds will be available hopefully from Friday of this week, and subsequent sessions you can see there will focus on using the opportunities of indoor and outdoor learning to help children's speech, language and communication. One on EAL, and then particularly one on parental engagement, home learning and school readiness. I will hand over to, sorry, I was the wrong one there, to Lynsey to take us through from today's aims. Thank you, Lynsey.
Okay, hi everybody. So as you can see on your screens, today's aims are to gain an understanding of typical speech sound development, to understand the differences between delayed and disordered speech, and finally to outline some essential tips to support children with their speech sound difficulties.
Smashing. Not moving on.
Okay, over to Isobel.
Hi everybody. So we take you, if you've been with us for the last two webinars, then you will recognise this slide. This is the language pyramid, and it shows us the different building blocks or the skills that are needed to be able to talk and to communicate. It's not an order of development. That's very important that you understand that it doesn't start with looking and listening and then the children play and then they understand and then they talk. But these are all sort of interlinked, but it's just a good representation of all the different skills that are needed for language development. So as you can see, as practitioners, you may recognise that parents usually become concerned about a child's speech sounds when they start thinking about how the child will cope when they're going to start school. It's usually about this time of year or just before that parents start getting concerned that, that their child's going to cope when they get to school. And they start worrying about the child potentially not being understood by their peers or by the staff at school. And often the child's unclear speech is the first thing that parents and carers notice, and not sometimes the underlying issues that are linked with speech sounds. Now you can see on the pyramid it says pronunciation. That's what we're talking about, it's speech sounds. But it's very, very heavily linked, as we go on to talk about later on, with attention and listening, which you can see is at the bottom of the pyramid. So these skills are very closely linked together. So what does speech sound development mean? Well, obviously they develop from birth, so from the early sounds that babies make when soon after birth, and they progress rapidly in the preschool years. You will know this from all the children in your settings. And we expect most children to be talking so that people can understand them by the age of 5. But some children do experience difficulties with their speech sound development, and they need that little bit of extra support. Now, whether that's support from you or whether that's more detailed support that they need from speech and language therapists, we'll go on to discuss exactly how you can determine which is which.
Okay, so you can see that this next chart shows typical speech sound development. Now you'll see lots of different publications, very, very similar to this one out there. Hopefully you've all seen them in your settings. This particular one is taken from the ECAT child monitoring tool, Every Child a Talker, for those people that weren't sure on what ECAT meant. Now this is a good developmental chart because it obviously shows typical speech sound development, but what I want you to note on this chart is the overlapping of the ages on each age-related stage. For example, you can see on the 0 to 11 months, the very first stage. The second stage, 8 to 20 months, obviously encompasses those 11 months, and we realise, I'm sure we all realise, the reason behind this is because we know that all children are different and develop at different rates. So this just gives you an indication of the kinds of ages in months the children should be at, typically. There are several, as I say, free downloadable resources, very, very similar to this one, that are out there, which can be copied for parents and practitioners. Often one that is very regularly used is one from Talking Point, which we do refer to at the very end of this presentation. However, we particularly like the very next chart on the PowerPoint, as this gives a specific indication of when you should be concerned and when you shouldn't be worried. This chart has actually been adapted by the head of service at ePut, specifically to help referrers differentiate when something is a problem and when it's not. Now, this will actually be available to you as a handout, which I'm sure we can make available for you. And this just shows a sample. You can see this goes up to age 2 years, 11 months. The sample handout should be available to you going up to age 4, so hopefully your children's ages should be covered there. Now, this might be worth copying and giving relevant sections to the practitioners that are working within your settings too, because they can then display it on the wall as a reference or put it up outside their rooms for parents to have a look at. But please do note on this particular one that, as I said with the other one, the ages do not overlap on here.
Right, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. They are explicit. There is a break at these 2 points.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through? I'm particularly interested in the second column. Would usually have the following: being able to print. Does that mean a child would normally be able to M, P, T, D, N, and W would be fine, or the word sound, or how? What's the reference on that particular the second column?
Well, it's, as you can see, it's building on from the previous one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's those sounds that will be able to be made inappropriately. So it's the sound it makes of w rather than necessarily w, etc.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I'm just it's the sound that we take.
It's not the letter sound.
Exactly.
That comes on to phonological awareness later on, much older.
So I should be concerned if a child at that time is completely silent anyway, not using any sounds, but not if there's a sound being made but I can't understand it because I don't know the child.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there an explanation for why there is a cut-off at 5 months and 6 months there, as opposed, as you said previously, that there's the overlap between the two?
It's an ish.
Right.
It's between 2, 2.5. This is the difference between health and education.
Right.
So this is being
this
is being written by health, whereas education tends to go by the EYFS, which overlaps a little bit more.
No, I can see that distinction. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want on that one? Will we move on?
No.
As we said, we can make this available to those who are registered on the slide, and there will be support materials that are coming out to support this entire series. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have some fun now. This is, as you can see, a side view of a head. So all speech sounds can be divided into their place, manner, and whether or not you use voice with them. So place will be where in the mouth the sound is created. Now, not often we just talk, don't we? Don't think about what our mouth is doing while we're talking. So sometimes the manner is quite important. So how the sound is, that's how the sound is made. So for example, if you put both your lips together, and please do this in the safety of your own home, if you put both lips together and form a stoppage for the air coming out, and you then release that air, you might make a sound. Okay?
Did I pass?
No, because you said
Oh, right.
However, if you use voice, then you would say okay.
I'm not even going to try, just to avoid the humiliation.
So the difference between the voice and the voiceless is p. It's made in the same way, and it's made in the same manner, in the same place and in the same manner. So another suggestion we could try, the sound might be made sort of by friction, made between two parts of the mouth. So if you make a s sound, as you're making the sound, think about where your tongue is in your mouth. So we tend to make it by creating a sort of funnel down the middle of our tongue, for the sound to come out all the way down the middle, and the edges of the tongue are resting on the roof of the mouth. Yeah? And because it's friction, it's called a fricative. You don't need to know this, what they're all called, but it's just quite interesting to think about what's happening in your mouth, really. And you can tell whether or not a sound is voiced or voiceless by putting your fingers on the front of your neck. And if you're making a voiced sound, you can feel it buzzing. That's your voice box. And if you're making a voiceless sound, it doesn't. So you won't feel anything. But you will. All vowel sounds are voiced. So it's a hugely complicated business. That's the real reason we put this on here, to show you how complicated speech sounds are. Because if you think about one word and how your mouth has got to change shape, your tongue's got to change shape, your voice has got to switch on and off, there's so much going on. It's a hugely complicated business.
And therefore not surprising, there are problems with it.
It's not surprising. And just a little interesting thing before we move on, if you will make that s sound again, think about where the front of your tongue is. Is it up behind your top teeth? Is it down behind your bottom teeth? We're all having a go here. Not sure about you.
Top teeth for me.
Top teeth for you. Well, very interestingly, actually 2/3 of people make the sound with the tongue tip up. 1/3 make the sound with the tongue tip down, which just goes to show that we all make sounds very slightly differently.
I'm going to ask why.
Why?
Do we know why?
Why
Is there a difference? How can you make the same? All right, I'm not even going to go there. No. But there's no explanation. It's fine.
Well, you know, I think it's just where you obviously, where you learned to do it. I mean, from the beginning. I don't know whether there's a genetic, I don't think we can go into the research behind the genetic cause. Or,
does that impact on dialect then, local dialects? Or is that a question too far?
That is nothing to do with dialect.
Okay.
But,
okay,
yeah,
thank you.
that would be to do
what
with
is
modeling.
interesting is if you then try to make the sound
Oh,
in a different way. Yeah.
Sorry, Sian is a long way from the microphone. People might not have picked that up.
If you then try and do it the other way, so if you normally put your tongue up, try making this sound with your tongue down. It's hard. It's quite hard. And then if you try and put that in a word like sausage,
Yeah, you can't.
it's really quite difficult.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually when we say to children, no, don't say it like that, say it like this. that's what you're actually asking them to do. If you can't do that with one sound, how can we expect children to just automatically switch the way they say things? So that's that. So speech sound difficulties can be classed as either delayed or disordered. So what do we mean by what's the difference between them? So a speech sound delay is when speech is developing in a normal sequential pattern, but occurring later than is typical. So I refer you back to those charts we looked at earlier in terms of the developmental pattern. A speech disorder, however, is when mistakes are not typical sound errors, or they're unusual sound errors or error patterns. So, for example, if you've got a child who only really uses vowel sounds, so that would be a disorder. That's obviously quite an extreme one. Or they might be doing different substitutions. So a typical substitution is when a child will do a t for a k. So instead of saying car, they will say tar. Now that's quite typical. But if every time they tried to say car, they used a different sound, right, that would be quite disordered. And a general rule of thumb is, if the close family member, so whoever it might be that spends most time with the child, if they are having difficulty understanding the child, it's quite likely to be a disorder. You can't say it's a general rule of thumb. It's not, you know. Whereas if it's a delay, you'll find that often parents might understand the child, but the lady in the corner shop can't. And that will be just, but it's a general rule of thumb. As
a general principle, you can see how that will work.
Yeah, okay. So, when do we refer either of those? So I can only speak really here from Southend perspective, from EPUT, the Speech and Language Therapy Service in EPUT. You will find that wherever you are in the country, your health service, your speech and language service provision will have different pathways and different criteria for referral. So you need to really find out what's going on in your area, because every service is different. So with EPUT, it's usually appropriate to refer a child whose speech sound development is delayed by about a year. And it's always advisable to get the child's hearing checked too, just because obviously that's the most obvious cause for some sort of delay or difficulty with speech sound development. Any child whose speech is considered to be disordered should be referred as soon as possible. So if you think there's something very strange going on here, make sure you get that referral in. And the therapist is particularly expert in working out what's going on, what patterns are developing, you know, and will be able to discuss the most appropriate strategies to use with the children. Okay, Lynsey.
I've had a question from Sarah. Do you have any views on the use of dummies, particularly in terms of delay? And are there any impacts of the use of dummies on speech sound development?
Okay, so I'm very against finger wagging. So I would never say never use dummies. Dummies can be quite useful for some parents in the very early days of a baby's life. The general advice you will find that's out there is that parents should try to have stopped using the dummy by the time the child's a year old. So the reason for that is, apart from, there's two reasons. One is around helping the child to develop their speech sounds, and secondly, it's much harder. The older the child gets, the much harder it is to try and remove the dummy. But it will have an impact. If you try talking with two fingers on your tongue, it's really quite difficult. You can't hold with your tongue being squashed flat. Orthodontists prefer orthodontic dummies to a thumb, right, being used. Speech and language therapists will prefer a thumb, because the thumb tends to be in the control of the child, and the child will take the thumb out to talk and put the thumb back in again. Whereas a dummy tends to get put in by the adult and left in, and it's a bung rather than
Or a plug. Yeah.
a plug, yeah, rather than
Yes, that's interesting.
anything else. So it is just, so it will impact on the child's speech the longer they go on using it after a year, because it's just sitting there holding the tongue down. And if you think back to the side of the head, and when we were playing with sounds, you've only got to talk and think about what your tongue is doing, especially the front of the tongue, the front half of the tongue, and how many sounds are made with the front half of the tongue. That's obviously going to have an impact if you're not able to use that.
And similarly, doesn't that go for sippy cups as well, Isobel? Could you expand on the use of sippy cups?
So moving from a bottle to a cup, again, it's really important that we don't use cups that have valves in the lid. So I know we don't like children tipping their cups over and making a big mess. So we just go for a non-spill cup with a little cap that fits over the lip, rather than, or a sort of 360-degree cup. Something with two handles to make it easier for the child to pick up. But if you have a valve in the cup, you might as well be giving them the bottle still, or a teat, because it's the same sucking motion that the child will use, and obviously that is articulation. That's all about how the muscles of the mouth are moving.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so we said we'd try and give you some top tips around ways to help children with speech sounds development. So here, this is really highlighting the need for listening and attention and how important that is. So if I just briefly refer back to that pyramid that Isobel was talking about at the beginning of the webinar, obviously the listening and attention is the bottom building block of that pyramid. So as you can see on here, it suggests that any child who's got good listening and attention skills will hopefully respond well to therapy, because they've got those skills in place before we're getting up to the pronunciation later on. So therefore that makes your role in earlier settings incredibly important, because you will be helping to develop those listening and attention skills. And we'll also be talking in a little while about modelling clear speech, and that's also a vital skill to get through to the children.
So in the delay situation of the year, waiting, the sense that there's a child year behind, it's not as though you're doing nothing in that year. What you are actually focusing on is giving consideration to the child's listening and attention skills. Yeah,
absolutely. And you'd also obviously check their hearing and so on,
yeah.
Do lots of different checks. And just as a pointer on there, that the younger children whose speech is difficult to understand and who hate sitting down to concentrate are much trickier, therefore, to work with. So if we get those listening and attention skills in place, that's a really good start of the 10. So you're probably all aware of the 2007 Department for Education publication that was called Letters and Sounds. So I could refer you to that. We have sort of spoken about this before in previous webinars, but that publication's got some really good ideas of different activities that can be done at home and in a setting, particularly phase 1 activities. There are 7 different aspects to that phase 1 publication, and basically the first 3 aspects are on general sound discrimination, so it's encouraging you to get out and about, listen with the children to different sounds in the environment. Making instrumental sounds is aspect 2, body percussion is aspect 3, and so on. 4 is rhythm and rhyme, but 5, 6 and 7, which are alliteration, voice sounds, and then the oral blending and segmenting, if you do get onto those with your older children, then in that publication it really encourages you to hone in on those last 3, the 5, 6 and 7, because it tells you ideas and areas that you can look out for to see if a child is possibly presenting with speech sound difficulties. So the next slide actually shows you some examples of typical listening and attention activities which parents and practitioners could do.
Just before I move it on to Lynsey, I'll share a comment that's come from Debbie. And I'm not surprised. Well, it's interesting. I'll just throw this in reference to the referral situation with speech and language, and it is a comment rather question. We find that waiting time for SLT is so long after referral, and then access to therapy means going back on a waiting list. This is very disheartening, as we are told it is our role to highlight children who need intervention.
Yeah, I totally empathise.
Yes, thank you, Debbie. We were probably expecting some sort of comments along those lines, because it is, as with any other service, one that is facing the issues we have around austerity and service limitations. So I'm sure your view is being shared by many who are joining us on this webinar. Lynsey.
Yeah, so as I was saying, just going back to some activities that you could be doing to help develop those speech skills in reference to listening and attention. So I'm not going to read through them all, but you can see copying a rhythm, listening games, I Spy, and listening walk. So some of our practitioners have actually used Tapestry or other kind of media to send these kinds of activities home on a weekly basis, or displayed them outside the room, so when parents are collecting they can see the kinds of things that they could be doing with their children. So it's not just for those children with potential speech sound difficulties. These are activities that any child universally could be engaging in. Okay, so the main thing is with all of this, if we refer back to the pyramid, is to show how important the listening intention section is, because without this it's harder for other areas such as speech sounds to develop.
I'm going to drop this in. When I was reading through the slides before, the Let's Listen one made me smile. You stand still, everybody close their eyes, and then you point to where they're hearing the sound. One player names the sound they all hear. Everybody points that sound. Then on the count of three, we'll go, are you all pointing in the same direction? Is there a particular concern if there is a child who isn't pointing in the same direction?
I think yes. I think that's someone you hone in on and play the game again and see if it happens again.
I'll be fascinated on any feedback from that from colleagues.
Oh yeah, so would I.
Thank you.
Okay. So some very general suggestions before we get on to the stages of learning to use a new sound. Make sure you always get the child's attention and eye contact or face watching before talking with them. Do get down to the child's level and speak slowly and clearly so they can see, hear and process the sounds you make as you're talking. Do use sentences appropriate to the developmental age of the child. Don't make them too long. Don't make them too short. Do be positive about the child's speech. And always take on board what we usually say is, my ears, as the adult, my ears aren't working properly. So you're not saying, I can't understand you. It's, oh, my ears aren't working properly today. Can you say that again? Can you show me? Etc. Don't listen to what they're saying, not how they're saying it, as much as you possibly can. And give the child the opportunity to speak freely, so constantly interrupting a child's conversation to correct the pronunciation will make it hard for them to formulate ideas and might reduce their confidence in talking. We'll go on to talk about modelling in a minute. And then actually referring to the slide in front of you, these are the stages that a speech therapist will follow when trying to learn to use a new sound. The first bullet point can go on for a long time. So gross, then fine auditory discrimination. So gross auditory discrimination, before you ask me, Michael,
thank you,
is can I hear the difference between a car sound or a helicopter? Okay, so they can be as completely diverse as that. And then you move through various stages, so you can then get sounds that are very similar. So like a car and a bus, for example, could be similar, and a lorry, etc. And then you would move gradually onto speech sounds themselves, and you would have the differences between sounds like b and s. They're very different. B might be much closer together. So you're moving them on a little journey, but it's all about, can they hear the difference between the sounds? Because it's no good trying to make children make a sound if they can't hear it. And if they haven't got it in their brains already, if they haven't understood and stored it, they can't then use that sound and withdraw it down, so to speak, from the brain and give instructions to all of the muscles of the mouth to try and make that sound. But we then work on making the sound, and then putting that sound at the beginning or the end of simple words. So if they're working on, you might work on sun or house, so it's the beginning or the end. And then can they say the sound in all sorts of words and sentences? And then you go on to consolidation, so not just in the therapy room, but can they do that outside at home or at school?
I'm not sure if I'm phrasing my question here correctly. That point you said in terms of there's little point if the children can't hear it. Is there also that link between sound and understanding? That actually what a sound refers to or what it symbolises, or is that later in a different process?
Yeah, it's more, that's a bit more complex.
Right.
I think it's just a question of can they hear the if they're saying spoon for spoon, they may not be hearing this at the beginning. So
right.
The more times you ask them to say, no, it's spoon, say spoon, go on, say spoon, say spoon, you know, etc., they're still going to say boon, thinking they're saying spoon. So it's a completely pointless exercise doing that with a child because they have to hear the difference between what they're saying and what the adult version is before they'll get that right themselves. So one way of sort of showing that is on this little chart. And again, we're going to include this in the pack that goes with this webinar. So it just summarises the things we've just spoken about.
Right. React to your child is not how. Don't measure. That's fascinating. Don't make the child repeat the word, because if they're hearing it correctly, then all you're doing is shaming them in some way because they don't understand.
It's about confidence again, because the more they have people going on at them, the less they're going to want to speak. So, you know, you could end up with all sorts of problems on your hands and not just a simple speech sound difficulty.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we said we would be referring to something called modelling. So regarding children's learning of language, part of speech and language development is innate, and then part of it is learned through the adults around them modelling the language. So we need to ensure that the models that we are providing as practitioners and their parents are providing are effective. So there's a lady called Caroline Bowen, who's a very well recognised speech and language therapist, and she has some top tips on modelling. So as you can see on the slide, it suggests an unhurried speech rate, i.e. a slower speech rate, and Isobel referred to that earlier on. Clear speech, short sentences, again reiterating what Isobel's already said. Vocabulary suited to the child's abilities, so you're not using sort of a higher suite of vocabulary that the child's just not going to understand for their age or their learning capabilities. And then repetitions and recasts. Some of you, I'm sure, know what a repetition is. It's when you're repeating back to the child. But a recast, if I just expand on that, that's where the parent or carer repeats something back that a child says. They either add more detailed language or they correct the language that the child's used and expand on it. For example, if a child were to say, I see car, you might say, I see a car. Or want juice, the child says, you might say, I want more apple juice, please. So you're recasting back to them, adding in the correct model of the language and perhaps also adding in a bit more detail depending on the child's age. However, there are some habits around modelling that we really need to avoid, and again Caroline Bowen goes on to suggest what these are. So you can see on the next slide where it's called ineffective modelling. We're just going to have a little play around with this. So you can see on here, well, Isobel's going to be the child, aren't you? I'll be the adult.
Yeah.
That's a big bird. A bit bird? Not a bit bird. It's a big bird. Oh, it's actually an eagle. Look at the size of its wings. Okay, you may hear that kind of response in setting or outside. So if you just think about what word did the child hear most?
It's the wrong,
Exactly, yeah, it's been repeated so many times back, it hasn't been correctly rephrased necessarily. And what would you remember as a child from that? Would you be able to remember anything about what it is I'm actually meant to be saying?
No, I got it wrong.
Yeah. So too much, it's ineffective because too much talk is used, the child's going to get confused, and it also sounds rather negative. Do you remember Isobel said earlier on, it's about being positive with the children, so you don't say it's not this, it's this, or try this, try saying it like that, and just keep repeating, it's not going to help them at all. There's too much information there, and the child has probably tuned out and not learned at all how to say the word big, have they, because it's all very confusing. Another ineffective strategy is over-exaggerated modelling. So Isobel's going to be the child again. Please, can I have one? You mean please? So here I've obviously over-exaggerated the word please. I haven't said please, I've said please, an over-exaggerating modelling scenario there. So again, very, very ineffective. So what is effective? It could be something such as this. I like his punny face. I like his funny face too. It's a really funny face. A funny face. Get it down. Get what down? Oh, get this down. Okay, I'll get it for you. So hopefully there we've summarised, we're doing it in a more positive way, it's quite succinct, and we're really emphasising the word that we're trying to encourage the child to learn through that effective modelling.
I can see there's a lot of workforce and team development necessary there, because that's a hard thing to sustain across a setting for a long period of time, isn't it? When there's a lot of other pressures as well, because that's quite a structured and a detailed approach to doing it, but I can see how effective it can be.
However, Michael, I will say, Sian and I were actually out in a South End setting recently doing some observations of adult-child interaction, and I think the practitioners were doing this without realising they were doing it, which was so positive, wasn't it, Sian? And we were actually saying, do you realise you just did some brilliant recasting there? And they were like, no, what's that? So what's great is people are actually doing it without maybe necessarily knowing they're doing it, but if you start labelling it and you know, putting it as your little setting target, that might be a way forward.
We've had a question in from Tony. Is there a link between speech sound problems and future literacy?
There can be, yes. So I think we know that children who have problems, persistent speech sound difficulties, so beyond the age of about 6,
right,
there are definite links between the speech sound difficulty and literacy.
But that's from our age perspective, it won't be necessarily manifesting itself.
No, that's why it's quite important to get as much of this covered as possible, certainly in the latter part of the age group that we're dealing with here. So it's really difficult, apart from modelling with the very young ones, it's actually quite difficult. Most speech and language therapy with speech sound development doesn't really start till they're about 3.5, 4.
Oh, right.
Because it's quite formalised, and children really, I mean, we play games, etc., but they need a certain level of understanding and that auditory discrimination, which is why it's really important to work on the listening and attention and all the other things we've talked about that can be worked on in setting. Even if they're not having speech therapy, it means that when the speech therapy does kick in, however long you have to wait for it, it actually, you know, you've laid all the foundations there. and it will be a much quicker process. They'll pick it up much quicker if it's just a simple delay, as opposed to a disorder. But mostly it's the disorders where there's a link between.
And most children, I'm assuming, just because in terms of our communications ability as adults, most children must respond well to input, because generally there is a universal ability to communicate, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well done, I suppose, is what I'm saying to the speech and language therapist. Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Tony, for the question.
I think we're there. I think we've come to the end.
Okay, do you just want to talk us? So those were the references we'd had, the L-Clan materials earlier on. ePut, for those who know, is the Essex Partnership University Trust, who we're grateful for sharing their staff and colleagues with us and their materials as well. Caroline Bowen we mentioned in terms of the modelling. The Letters and Sounds is the 2007 publication, seems like only yesterday, and ECAT, I'm assuming most people are still aware of, and materials are still generally available.
They are available online, yeah.
Thank you. Any just further information you need to direct us to? The Lucid?
Yes, I think that was something that we put in, I think, in one of our previous webinars as well. It was just about gestures, and I think it was the importance of, you know, when a child is first making sounds, initial sounds, and they're pointing to objects in relation to the sounds that they're making. There was lots of online research around that. So I think that's just been added in as a reminder to people, because it was sort of quite groundbreaking at the time, so I wanted people to have a look at that.
It was around the diminutives as well.
Oh,
That's
that's
around
right.
money, because you're emphasising the way that the sounds are put together.
Thank you.
That word.
And the TES article, what's that? I'm not aware of that one. Oh, I'm looking at Shana, she's a long way from the microphone. Never mind, we'll come on to that. I suggest you search that out for yourselves. And the last slide, I think, is another example.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to earlier on,
the
talking point.
Documentation earlier on in terms of managing opportunity to see where children are as a placement. Okay, thank you for that, everybody. I'll do my usual bit of waffle whilst if anybody is typing any questions that they want. As ever, it's my thanks to Sian, Lynsey and Isobel for taking us through today's session. There's some fascinating elements in there about something which, as you say, we take for granted as adults, but the complexity, it's remarkable that we actually all managed to do it, isn't it? Any of us talk at all. But as I say, it doesn't look like any questions are coming through. It just remains for me to thank everybody for their attendance today. I think we've also, yes, there we go. The final slide is the next in the series, which we hope you join us for on the 17th of July, hopefully just before your summer holidays, looking at the language-rich environments that we can get from indoors and outdoors. So please put that in your diaries. We will aim to start at the same time, 4 o'clock. And it just saves me to say thank you very much for attending, and we hope you found it useful and entertaining. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.